I'm Brianna Sullivan, 28 years old, and I'm standing in the pouring rain watching my entire life get thrown onto the driveway like garbage. My father's face is twisted with rage as he hurls my art supplies into the storm, screaming over the thunder, "You're a worthless disappointment. Go live in the streets where you belong." My mother stands behind him, arms crossed, adding her own venom, 28 years of shame and failure. The iron gates of what used to be my home slam shut with a finality that echoes through my chest. As I stand there soaked and shaking, car headlights suddenly pierce through the darkness, heading straight toward me. Before we dive into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button if you've ever felt rejected by the people who were supposed to love you most, and don't forget to subscribe because this story gets so much more intense. You won't believe what my own family was willing to do to destroy me completely. Earlier that morning, I had been floating on cloud nine. After years of struggling as an artist, the prestigious Whitmore Gallery had finally accepted my portfolio for their Emerging Artist Showcase. I could barely contain my excitement as I drove up to the family estate, clutching the acceptance letter like a golden ticket. This was it, my chance to prove that all those years of wasting time on art weren't wasted at all. The Sullivan family dinner table had always been a battlefield, but that night it became a slaughter. I walked into the dining room expecting maybe, just maybe, some congratulations. Instead, I found my parents, my sister Courtney, and my brother Derek all wearing the same cold, calculating expressions. My father didn't even let me speak before he started his attack. "We need to talk about your little art hobby," he said, the word hobby dripping with contempt. "It's time you stopped this nonsense and joined the real world." I tried to show them the acceptance letter, my hands trembling with excitement, but my mother actually laughed. A harsh, bitter sound that cut through me like glass. "Oh sweetheart," she said, "you don't actually think that's real, do you?" The confusion on my face must have been evident because Courtney couldn't contain her glee anymore. She pulled out a manila folder and spread dozens of rejection letters across the mahogany table. Letters I had never seen before, all bearing the logos of galleries and art schools I had applied to over the years. "I've been intercepting your mail for 3 years, Courtney announced proudly, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table. "Every acceptance, every scholarship offer, every opportunity. I made sure you never saw them." My world started spinning as Derek joined in, his voice filled with cruel amusement. "Remember that portfolio you spent 6 months preparing for the Richardson Institute? I threw it in the fireplace. The backup copies too. Found them in your old room and burned every single piece." The room felt like it was closing in on me as my parents explained their twisted logic. They wanted me to toughen up, to abandon my dreams and join the family's ruthless real estate empire. My father leaned forward, his eyes cold as winter. "We built this company from nothing, and you're going to inherit it whether you like it or not. This art nonsense was always going to end, Brianna. We just helped speed up the process." But the worst betrayal was yet to come. My mother slid a legal document across the table, the papers crisp and official looking. "Your grandmother's cottage," she said simply. "The one she left specifically to you in her will. We need you to sign it over to Derek. He's expanding his investment portfolio, and that property is worth considerable money now that the area has been developed." I stared at the deed transfer papers in disbelief. That cottage wasn't just property to me. It was where Grandma Rose had taught me to paint, where she had encouraged my artistic dreams when everyone else called them foolish. It was the only place I had ever felt truly understood and accepted. "I'm not signing this," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You can't make me sign this." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of red as he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You ungrateful little brat," he snarled. "After everything we've given you, every opportunity, every advantage, and this is how you repay us?" He grabbed my wrist, trying to force the pen into my hand. "You'll sign it right now, or you'll get nothing from this family ever again." When I jerked away from him, that's when things got physical. Derek jumped up to help restrain me while Courtney called for the security guards. I couldn't believe what was happening. These people, my own flesh and blood, were literally trying to force me to sign away the only thing I had left of my grandmother's love. The guards arrived within minutes, two massive men who looked more like bouncers than security personnel. As they dragged me toward the front door, I could hear my family's voices behind me, cold and detached as if they were discussing the weather. "Make sure she understands she's not welcome back until she's ready to be reasonable," my mother called out. My father added, "And get rid of all that art garbage cluttering up her room. Burn it if you have to." The last thing I saw before they threw me outside was Courtney filming the whole scene on her phone, probably planning to use it against me somehow later. The massive front doors slammed shut, and I heard the locks clicking into place, followed by the hum of the electronic security system activating. That first night sleeping in my grandmother's old Honda Civic was the longest of my life. I had managed to keep one key to the car hidden from my family, and it was stored in a public garage about 10 miles from the estate. The back seat was cramped and cold, but it was shelter. I curled up under an old blanket that smelled like Grandma Rose's lavender perfume and tried to process what had just happened. My entire family had been systematically destroying my future for years, and I had been completely oblivious to it. The next few weeks were a crash course in survival. I quickly learned which fast food places had the cleanest bathrooms, which coffee shops would let me sit for hours nursing a single cup, and which library branches stayed open latest. I applied for every minimum wage job I could find, but maintaining any semblance of dignity while living in a car was nearly impossible. The constant worry about where to shower, where to sleep safely, and how to keep my clothes clean enough for job interviews was exhausting. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort, though. It was watching my old life crumble as my family systematically turned everyone against me. My former friends started avoiding my calls, and when I finally cornered my best friend Melissa at the coffee shop where she worked, I understood why. "Brianna, honey," she said, looking genuinely concerned, "your parents told everyone you've been having some kind of breakdown. They said you're on drugs and that you've been stealing from them. They're just trying to help you get better." I begged her to listen to my side of the story, to understand that my family was lying, but the doubt in her eyes was clear. Who was she going to believe? The respected, wealthy Sullivan family with their spotless reputation, or her disheveled friend who was clearly struggling? It was then that I realized how thoroughly my parents had planned this destruction. They hadn't just kicked me out. They had poisoned every potential source of support I might have had. The betrayal got worse 2 weeks later when Melissa called my parents to report my location. I had trusted her enough to tell her where I was staying, and she had immediately turned that information over to them. Within hours, a tow truck arrived to repossess the Honda, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a single backpack of belongings. The repo man handed me an official document stating that the car loan was in default due to my inability to maintain steady employment and housing. Of course, my family had been making the payments all along, but they had somehow arranged for the loan to be transferred into my name and then defaulted. That night, I found myself at the Harbor Street shelter, a place I never imagined I would need. The intake process was humiliating, but the social worker was kind. She explained the rules, the curfews, and the reality that beds were limited and assigned on a first-come, first-served basis each evening. It was there that I met Grace, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and surprisingly sharp blue eyes. While other residents avoided eye contact and kept to themselves, Grace watched me with an intensity that was both comforting and unsettling. Grace became my first real ally in this nightmare. She had been homeless for 3 years, but there was something different about her, something that suggested she hadn't always lived this way. She taught me which shelters were safest, which soup kitchens had the best food, and most importantly, which areas of the city to avoid after dark. "The streets have their own rules," she told me one evening as we shared a package of crackers. "Your old rules don't apply here. You need to learn fast, or you won't survive." It was Grace who warned me about the private investigator who had been asking questions about me around the neighborhood. A well-dressed man with a camera who claimed to be doing welfare checks but was clearly gathering information for someone with money. When I described him to Grace, her expression darkened. "Your family's not done with you yet," she said grimly. "People like that don't just walk away. They want something more." She was right. Within days, every job I had applied for suddenly disappeared. Managers who had seemed interested would call back with awkward explanations about new information that had come to light about my instability and reliability issues. Someone was systematically sabotaging every opportunity one tried to create for myself. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My family wasn't just content to throw me out and cut me off. They were actively working to ensure I could never rebuild my life. The psychological warfare was relentless. Anonymous tips were called into shelters claiming I was violent or unstable, resulting in me being turned away on nights when beds were already scarce. Someone had been spreading rumors that I was a drug addict who would steal from other residents. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. The same family that had accused me of being a failure was now working overtime to ensure that I actually would fail. The harassment escalated dramatically after I had been on the streets for a month. The private investigator became bolder, no longer bothering to hide his surveillance. I would spot him across the street from whatever shelter I was staying at, taking photos and making notes. He followed me to job interviews, to the library, even to the free clinic when I needed medical attention for a respiratory infection I had developed from sleeping rough. Grace had connections throughout the homeless community, and through them, we learned that my family had hired more than just one investigator. There was an entire campaign being waged against me, complete with financial incentives for anyone who could provide information about my activities or location. They were paying homeless people small amounts of cash to report on me, creating a network of spies among the very people I was trying to find community with. The situation reached a new low when my cousin Tommy showed up at the shelter one evening, claiming he wanted to help. Tommy had always been the black sheep of the Sullivan family, the one who understood what it was like to disappoint our parents' high expectations. He hugged me and told me how sorry he was about what had happened, how he had been fighting with the family about their treatment of me. He offered to let me stay in his apartment, to help me get back on my feet away from the chaos of shelter life. For 3 days, I felt almost human again. I had a real bed, access to a shower, and the ability to cook actual meals. Tommy seemed genuinely supportive, encouraging me to tell him everything about my family's behavior and helping me document what had happened. He even drove me to a few job interviews, waiting patiently in the car while I met with potential employers. I started to believe that maybe I had one family member who actually cared about me. The trap revealed itself when I came back from a particularly promising interview to find my parents' lawyer sitting in Tommy's living room. Mr. Henderson was holding a stack of legal documents and wearing the same cold smile my father favored. "Hello, Brianna," he said calmly. "I think it's time we discussed your future." Tommy couldn't meet my eyes as the truth became clear. He had been working with my family all along, gathering information and evidence they could use against me. The papers Mr. Henderson spread across Tommy's coffee table were a petition for guardianship based on mental incompetency. They contained detailed reports about my erratic behavior, my inability to maintain employment, and my dangerous living conditions. Every conversation I had had with Tommy, every moment of vulnerability I had shared, had been recorded and twisted into evidence of my supposed mental instability. The petition even included photos of me sleeping in the car and at various shelters, making me look as desperate and unhinged as possible. "Your family is concerned about your welfare," Mr. Henderson explained in his practiced, condescending tone. "These documents will allow them to make medical and financial decisions on your behalf until you're able to get the help you clearly need." The implications hit me like a freight train. If this petition was granted, my parents would have legal control over every aspect of my life. They could have me committed, could access any benefits I might be entitled to, could make decisions about my medical care. It would be legal slavery disguised as concern. I ran from that apartment faster than I had ever run in my life, leaving behind the few possessions I had managed to accumulate. Tommy called after me, actually having the audacity to sound concerned, but I knew now that every word out of his mouth was a lie. Grace was waiting at our usual meeting spot outside the downtown library, and one look at my face told her everything she needed to know. "They got to your cousin," she said simply. It wasn't even a question. That night, as we sat in a 24-hour diner nursing cups of coffee we could barely afford, Grace helped me understand the full scope of what I was up against. "Your family has money, connections, and a reputation to protect," she explained quietly. "They can't afford to have you out here telling people what really happened. You're a loose end they need to tie up, one way or another." The weight of her words settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't just about punishing me for refusing to sign over the cottage. This was about controlling the narrative and protecting their image. The stalking intensified after the failed guardianship attempt. Now there were multiple investigators, and they weren't just watching me anymore. They were actively sabotaging my efforts to survive. Job interviews would be interrupted by mysterious phone calls about my criminal background or my history of mental illness. Shelter workers would receive anonymous tips that I was carrying drugs or weapons, resulting in searches that always turned up nothing but accomplished their goal of making me unwelcome. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. I started having panic attacks, jumping at shadows, constantly looking over my shoulder. Sleep became nearly impossible because I never knew when or where the next attack would come from. Grace watched me deteriorating with growing concern, and one night she made a decision that probably saved my life. She introduced me to Marcus, a legal aid attorney who specialized in cases involving family abuse and financial exploitation. Marcus was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a manner that immediately put me at ease. He listened to my story without judgment, taking careful notes and asking questions that showed he understood the legal complexities of what my family was doing. When I finished explaining everything, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head in amazement. "I've seen family disputes get ugly," he said, "but this is systematic harassment on a level I rarely encounter. Your family is essentially trying to make you disappear." Marcus dove into my case with a dedication that amazed me. He worked pro bono, explaining that he had grown up in a similar situation with wealthy family members who used their resources to control and manipulate. He understood the psychological warfare tactics my family was employing because he had lived through them himself. Our first step was to document everything, creating a timeline of harassment and building evidence that could be presented in court. The investigation revealed layers of corruption I hadn't even suspected. Marcus discovered that my parents had been embezzling from their own charity foundation, the Sullivan Children's Medical Fund, for over 5 years. Money that was supposed to help kids with cancer was being diverted into offshore accounts and shell companies controlled by Derek. The charity fraud was sophisticated, involving fake invoices for medical equipment that was never purchased and inflated administrative costs that lined my family's pockets. We also uncovered evidence that my college fund, which should have contained over $100,000, had been systematically drained to expand Derek's investment portfolio. The transfers were disguised as educational expenses, but the money had actually gone toward purchasing rental properties that were generating income exclusively for my brother. Every penny my grandparents had saved for my education had been stolen, and the documentation showed my parents had been planning this for years. But just as we were building momentum, Courtney struck back with devastating effectiveness. She filed a restraining order against me, claiming that I had been stalking her and making threats against the family. The petition included what appeared to be threatening text messages sent from my phone number, recordings of disturbing voicemails, and witness statements from family friends who swore I had made violent threats at social gatherings I had never attended. The hearing for the restraining order was my first time back in the same room as my family since that terrible night. They looked exactly as I remembered, perfectly dressed and radiating respectability. Courtney played her role to perfection, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she described her fear for her safety. My mother spoke about my mental deterioration with practiced sadness, while my father presented himself as a concerned patriarch trying to help his troubled daughter while protecting his other children. Judge Morrison seemed initially inclined to grant the restraining order. My family's lawyer presented their evidence with polished efficiency, and I could see the doubt creeping into the judge's expression as he looked at me in my thrift store clothes with my court-appointed attorney. Everything about the situation reinforced their narrative that I was the unstable, dangerous one while they were the victims trying to protect themselves from my erratic behavior. That's when Marcus revealed our first major piece of evidence. He had hired a forensic digital expert who proved that the threatening messages had been sent using spoofing technology that made them appear to come from my phone while actually originating from a computer registered to Derek's business. The voice recordings were similarly fabricated, using voice synthesis software and samples of my speech taken from family videos posted on social media. Judge Morrison's demeanor changed completely when the technical evidence was presented. His questions became sharper, more focused on the inconsistencies in my family's story. Why hadn't they reported these threats to police immediately? How had they obtained recordings of threatening calls if they were truly afraid for their safety? Why were there no witnesses to my supposed erratic behavior outside of their own social circle? The restraining order was denied, but the victory felt hollow because I knew it was just the first round in what would be a much longer fight. As we left the courthouse, Derek cornered Marcus in the parking lot while I was still inside gathering our paperwork. By the time I got outside, Marcus was shaken and angry. Derek had offered him $50,000 to drop my case and had followed that bribery attempt with a threat that made my blood run cold. "We'll destroy anyone who helps her," Derek had said calmly. "We have investigators who can find dirt on anyone, and we have enough money to make legal problems appear and disappear. Think about your career, your reputation, your family. Is helping my crazy sister really worth losing everything?" Marcus was furious about the attempted bribery, but I could see that the threat had rattled him. My family wasn't just coming after me anymore. They were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. The next blow came from an unexpected source. Uncle Robert, my father's brother who had helped raise me after my parents' divorce when I was young, agreed to testify against me in the guardianship hearing that my family had rescheduled. Uncle Robert had been like a second father to me, the one who taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework when my parents were too busy with their business empire. His betrayal cut deeper than almost any of the others because I had genuinely believed he loved me. His testimony was devastating in its apparent sincerity. He spoke about watching my mental decline over the past few years, about conversations where I had expressed paranoid thoughts about my family, about incidents where I had seemed disconnected from reality. Every word was a carefully crafted lie, but his reputation and genuine emotion made it believable. As he spoke, I realized that my family had been planning this character assassination for much longer than I had understood. Grace had been teaching me about psychological manipulation tactics during our late-night conversations at the shelter. She explained how abusers use their victims' own emotions and relationships against them, how they isolate their targets by turning everyone against them. "Your family is playing a long game," she told me one night as we watched the city skyline from a bench in the park. "They're not just trying to control you now. They're trying to erase the possibility that you could ever threaten them in the future." That's when Grace revealed something that changed everything. She wasn't just a homeless woman who had learned street survival through hard experience. She was a former federal investigator who had specialized in white-collar crime and financial fraud. She had been living undercover in the homeless community for 3 years, gathering intelligence on a corruption network that involved several prominent families in the city, including mine. "I've been watching your family for 2 years," she admitted quietly. "The Sullivan real estate empire is built on more than just aggressive business practices. They've been laundering money for organized crime figures, using their charity foundation and property development projects to clean dirty cash. Your grandmother discovered what they were doing shortly before she died, and I think that's why your parents are so desperate to control you now." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My grandmother's death hadn't been from natural causes as we had all believed. Grace suspected that she had been murdered to prevent her from exposing the money laundering operation. The cottage that my parents wanted me to sign over wasn't just valuable real estate. It contained evidence that could bring down their entire criminal enterprise. Evidence that my grandmother had hidden before her death, evidence that I was supposed to inherit along with the property. Armed with Grace's real identity and expertise, Marcus and I began building a case that went far beyond family abuse into federal criminal territory. Grace's FBI contacts were still active, and she was able to get our evidence into the right hands for a preliminary investigation. The scope of my family's crimes was staggering. Beyond the charity fraud and money laundering, they had been involved in tax evasion, witness intimidation, and what appeared to be at least 3 suspicious deaths over the past decade. The investigative journalist Grace connected us with was named Hazel, a woman in her 40s who had built her career exposing corruption among the wealthy and powerful. Hazel was fascinated by our story, particularly the personal angle of a daughter being systematically destroyed for threatening to expose her family's crimes. She began her own investigation, using her media connections to dig into public records and financial documents that we couldn't access through legal channels. My family's response to our growing investigation was swift and brutal. The accident that nearly killed me was clearly intentional, though proving it would have been impossible. I was crossing the street outside the legal aid office when a black SUV with tinted windows ran the red light and would have hit me if Grace hadn't grabbed my arm and yanked me backward at the last second. The vehicle didn't stop, and the license plate was obscured by mud, but the message was clear. The hospitalization from my injuries was financially devastating. Even with emergency Medicaid, there were bills for tests and treatments that I couldn't afford. The social worker assigned to my case seemed sympathetic at first, asking questions about my living situation and family support system. It wasn't until later that I realized she was gathering information for another guardianship petition. She had been hired by my family's lawyer to build a case that I was unable to care for myself due to both mental illness and medical incapacity. Grace's network of contacts proved invaluable during this period. Former colleagues from her FBI days helped us navigate the bureaucratic maze of getting proper medical advocacy, while Marcus worked overtime to prevent the guardianship petition from moving forward. We discovered that my parents had been working with corrupt officials in the healthcare system, people who were willing to provide false documentation about my mental state in exchange for generous donations to their personal projects. The breakthrough came when we finally accessed my grandmother's safety deposit box. Grace had suspected it existed based on financial records that showed regular payments to a bank for box rental fees, but tracking it down took weeks of detective work. The key had been hidden in the cottage that my parents so desperately wanted me to sign over, sewn into the lining of an old jewelry box that seemed worthless. What we found in that safety deposit box was enough evidence to bring down not just my family, but an entire network of corrupt officials and organized crime figures they had been working with. My grandmother had been documenting their activities for years, collecting financial records, recording conversations, and building a comprehensive file that detailed every aspect of their criminal operations. She had known they would eventually try to silence her, so she had prepared this insurance policy for whoever inherited her cottage. The evidence included recordings of my father discussing the murder of his former business partner, a man who had threatened to go to the authorities about the money laundering scheme 5 years earlier. His death had been ruled an accidental drowning, but the recordings revealed that he had been killed and his body dumped in the lake to make it look like he had fallen from his boat while fishing. Derek and 2 other men had carried out the actual murder under my father's direction. There were also detailed financial records showing how the charity fraud worked, with fake invoices and shell companies used to steal millions of dollars meant for children's cancer treatment. The scope of their theft was breathtaking. Money that could have saved young lives had been diverted to fund my family's luxurious lifestyle and expand their criminal operations. The evidence included photographs of fake medical equipment purchases and documentation of bribes paid to charity oversight officials. But perhaps the most damning evidence was my grandmother's written account of how my parents had killed her. She had discovered their crimes and confronted them, threatening to go to the FBI unless they stopped immediately. Instead of ending their criminal activities, they had decided to eliminate the threat she posed. The method had been sophisticated, using insulin injections to cause what appeared to be a natural diabetic episode, even though my grandmother had never been diagnosed with diabetes. Grace explained that this type of murder was nearly impossible to detect after the fact, especially when the victim was elderly and had other health issues that could explain sudden death. The only reason we had proof was because my grandmother had suspected what they were planning and had managed to document their preparations. She had even recorded a conversation where my mother discussed the technical aspects of insulin poisoning with someone who was clearly a medical professional willing to provide advice for the right price. The psychological impact of learning that my family had murdered my grandmother was devastating. This woman who had loved me unconditionally, who had encouraged my artistic dreams and provided the only safe space I had ever known, had been killed by her own son because she tried to stop his criminal activities. The cottage they wanted me to sign over wasn't just valuable property. It was the scene of her murder and a repository of evidence that could bring her killers to justice. Marcus immediately took our evidence to the FBI, while Hazel began preparing her news series that would expose the entire network. But my family wasn't going to go down without a fight. The attempt on Marcus's life came just 3 days after we met with federal investigators. He was leaving his apartment when 2 men approached him in the parking garage. If his neighbor hadn't interrupted by coming home at exactly that moment, Marcus would have been killed. As it was, he spent 2 weeks in intensive care with severe head trauma and internal injuries. My family's mask of respectability finally began to slip as federal investigators started closing in on their operations. The FBI raids on their business offices and personal residences were conducted simultaneously, preventing them from destroying evidence or warning their criminal partners. Local news coverage showed Derek being led away in handcuffs while trying to hide his face from cameras, and my father shouting at reporters about harassment and false accusations. Courtney's breakdown during her arrest was particularly satisfying to watch. She had always prided herself on being untouchable, using her beauty and charm to manipulate everyone around her. But when federal agents showed up at her apartment with a warrant for conspiracy and fraud charges, she completely fell apart. Her live confession on television was unplanned and devastating, a rambling admission of guilt that destroyed any hope the family had of mounting a unified defense. "We never meant for it to go this far," she sobbed into the camera while being loaded into a police car. "It started with just moving some money around, making sure Derek had enough capital for his investments. But then Grandma Rose found out, and she was going to ruin everything. We couldn't let her destroy our family's reputation. And then Brianna started asking questions about her inheritance, and we knew she would figure it out eventually." Uncle Robert's conscience had finally awakened, but his attempt to switch sides came too late to matter. He approached Marcus while he was still recovering in the hospital, offering to testify against his siblings in exchange for immunity. But the evidence we already had was so comprehensive that his testimony was unnecessary. His decades of silence and complicity had made him an accessory to multiple felonies, and the prosecutors were not inclined to offer deals to someone who had only found his moral compass after getting caught. The community response to the news coverage was overwhelming. People who had donated to the Sullivan Children's Medical Fund were outraged to learn that their contributions had been stolen to fund a criminal lifestyle. Families whose children had been denied treatment because of insufficient funds came forward with heartbreaking stories about how my family's theft had directly caused suffering and death. The scope of the victims was staggering, including not just the children who had been denied medical care, but also the legitimate charities that had been outbid for grants because of my family's fraudulent applications. Grace's art gallery connection, which I learned later was another part of her undercover operation, organized a surprise exhibition of my work while the news story was still breaking. The gallery owner had been holding pieces that my grandmother had secretly commissioned from me over the years, purchasing them through intermediaries so my family wouldn't know about the transactions. Seeing my art displayed professionally for the first time, surrounded by people who appreciated and understood it, was an emotional experience that nearly brought me to tears. The opening night of the exhibition drew a huge crowd, many of whom came specifically because they had heard my story on the news. Local artists, community activists, and ordinary people who were inspired by my survival came to show their support. For the first time in months, I felt like I was surrounded by people who saw me as a person rather than a problem to be solved or a threat to be eliminated. But my family's final desperate moves were yet to come. Even from jail, my parents managed to orchestrate one last attempt to silence me permanently. The random mugging that nearly killed me was clearly planned and executed by professional criminals. If Marcus hadn't been following me on his way home from physical therapy, and if his recovery hadn't given him the paranoia to notice the setup, I would have died in that alley. The attack was brutal and efficient. Two men approached me as I was walking home from the gallery, claiming to be lost tourists asking for directions. When I stopped to help them, one grabbed me from behind while the other pulled out a knife. The only reason I survived was because Marcus came around the corner at exactly the right moment and started shouting, scaring them off before they could finish what they had started. The incident finally galvanized the police into taking the threats against me seriously. The FBI assigned protective custody details to both Marcus and me while they continued building their case against my family's criminal network. The scope of the investigation had expanded to include several other prominent families and dozens of public officials who had been taking bribes or providing protection for the money laundering operation. Media attention intensified as more details about the case became public. Hazel's investigative series won several journalism awards and led to additional investigations in other cities where similar corruption networks were suspected. My story became a symbol of how wealth and influence could be used to destroy the lives of anyone who threatened to expose wrongdoing, and the public response was overwhelmingly supportive. The crowdfunding campaign that started organically among people who heard my story raised enough money to pay for my medical expenses and provide a small financial cushion while the legal proceedings continued. Artists from around the country reached out to offer support and encouragement, creating a network of creative professionals who understood the value of protecting artistic freedom and expression. For the first time since this nightmare began, I started to believe that I might actually have a future worth looking forward to. The federal trial was a media sensation that lasted for 3 months and resulted in convictions for all the major players in my family's criminal network. My father received 25 years in federal prison for murder, conspiracy, money laundering, and fraud. Derek got 15 years for his role in the murder and for running the day-to-day operations of the money laundering scheme. Even Courtney, despite her cooperation and confession, received 5 years for fraud and conspiracy charges. Uncle Robert's sentence was lighter due to his eventual cooperation, but he still faced 3 years in prison and permanent disbarment from his legal practice. The judge noted that his position of trust as an attorney made his complicity in the scheme particularly egregious, and that his late conversion to honesty didn't excuse decades of criminal behavior. His testimony did help convict several other participants in the network, but it couldn't repair the damage his silence had allowed to continue. The civil lawsuits filed by the families of children who had been denied medical treatment were devastating to what remained of my family's financial empire. The Sullivan estate was liquidated to pay damages to victims, with the family mansion being sold and the proceeds distributed among the families whose children had suffered because of the charity fraud. Watching bulldozers tear down the house where I had grown up was surprisingly cathartic, like watching a symbol of everything toxic and destructive in my life being erased. My inheritance from my grandmother's true estate, which had been hidden through a complex trust structure to protect it from my family's criminal activities, was substantial enough to provide genuine financial security for the first time in my life. But more importantly, it came with a letter she had written specifically for me, explaining her hopes for my artistic career and her pride in my dedication to creative expression despite family pressure. The art therapy program I established with part of the inheritance money became a model for similar programs in other cities. Working with homeless individuals and abuse survivors, helping them find their own creative voices and use art as a tool for healing, gave my own survival a deeper purpose. Grace became my co-director, using her investigative skills to help program participants navigate bureaucratic systems and access resources they needed. Marcus and my relationship had evolved naturally from professional cooperation to genuine friendship and eventually to something deeper. His recovery from the attack had been long and difficult, but it had also shown me the kind of person he truly was. His dedication to justice wasn't just professional, it was personal, rooted in his own experiences with family trauma and his commitment to protecting others from similar abuse. The community support that had sustained me through the worst periods of this ordeal continued long after the legal proceedings ended. The gallery that had first exhibited my work became a regular venue for showing pieces created by program participants, and the success of these exhibitions helped fund additional services for abuse survivors. Seeing other people find their voices and tell their stories through art was more rewarding than any personal recognition I received. Hazel's book about the case became a bestseller and led to additional investigations of similar corruption networks in other cities. Her detailed account of how my family had used their wealth and influence to destroy anyone who threatened them became required reading in law enforcement training programs focused on white-collar crime. The book also established a foundation that provided legal assistance to individuals facing retaliation from powerful families or organizations. Courtney's attempts to rebuild her life after prison were complicated by the fact that her confession had been so public and comprehensive. Her cooperation with prosecutors had helped convict several other criminals, but it had also made her a target for retaliation from those who remained at large. She eventually entered a witness protection program and disappeared from public view, which was probably the best outcome for everyone involved. The vindication of seeing justice served was sweet, but the real victory was deeper and more personal. I had survived an attempt to destroy not just my life, but my identity and my sense of self-worth. The people who were supposed to love and protect me had instead tried to erase me entirely, and I had not only survived their attacks but had exposed their crimes and helped protect future victims from similar harm. The dawn raid on my parents' temporary residence 6 months after their initial arrest was the final act in bringing their criminal empire to justice. Federal agents had tracked additional money laundering activities they had attempted to coordinate from jail through corrupt lawyers and remaining criminal associates. The images of my father being led away in shackles while trying to hide behind a newspaper were broadcast nationally, cementing the family's fall from respected business leaders to convicted felons. Derek's attempt to appeal his conviction based on claims of prosecutorial misconduct failed spectacularly when additional evidence surfaced showing that he had tried to intimidate witnesses from his jail cell. The additional charges resulted in an extended sentence, effectively ensuring that he would spend the rest of his productive adult years in federal prison. His former associates quickly distanced themselves from him, and his business empire collapsed as investors fled and creditors demanded immediate payment. The ripple effects of the convictions extended far beyond my immediate family. The corruption network they had been part of included judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials who had been taking bribes to look the other way or actively suppress investigations. The federal task force created to investigate these connections resulted in dozens of additional arrests and a comprehensive reform of oversight procedures for charitable organizations and real estate development projects. My new life took shape gradually, built on foundations that were solid rather than superficial. The art therapy program grew from a small pilot project to a comprehensive service that helped hundreds of trauma survivors each year. Grace's expertise in investigation and my artistic background created a unique approach that addressed both practical needs and emotional healing. Our success rate in helping people transition from crisis to stability was remarkable, attracting attention from social service agencies across the country. The romantic relationship with Marcus developed slowly and naturally, without the desperate intensity that had characterized so much of our early interactions. He understood trauma in ways that most people couldn't, and his own healing process helped him support mine without trying to fix or rescue me. Our partnership was built on mutual respect and shared values rather than dependency or drama, which made it stronger and more sustainable than any relationship I had experienced before. The second gallery opened 2 years after the first exhibition, specifically designed to showcase work created by people who had overcome significant trauma or disadvantage. The opening featured pieces by program participants alongside work by established artists who wanted to support our mission. The community response was overwhelming, with local businesses and individuals providing ongoing funding that allowed us to expand services and reach more people in need. Uncle Robert's efforts to make amends through charity work were genuine but limited by his criminal record and the understandable suspicion of organizations that had been victimized by his family's fraud. His volunteer work with legal aid programs that helped low-income families navigate court systems was valuable, but it couldn't undo decades of enabling and covering up serious crimes. His children had cut all contact with him, which was probably appropriate given his role in enabling the harm that had been done to so many families. Hazel's continued investigative work uncovered similar patterns of corruption in several other major cities, leading to a national conversation about the need for stronger oversight of charitable organizations and more aggressive prosecution of white-collar crime. Her foundation provided legal support to dozens of individuals facing retaliation from powerful interests, creating a network of protection that hadn't existed when I was fighting my family alone. The media attention generated by the case had unexpected positive outcomes for many other abuse survivors. Seeing someone successfully fight back against wealthy, powerful abusers inspired others to come forward with their own stories and seek help from appropriate agencies. The visibility of the case also led to increased funding for programs serving domestic violence victims and survivors of family financial abuse. My parents' final years in prison were marked by continued attempts to manipulate and control from behind bars. They tried to appeal their convictions, filed lawsuits claiming prosecutorial misconduct, and even attempted to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could challenge the distribution of my grandmother's estate. All of these efforts failed, but they demonstrated that prison had not changed their fundamental character or their belief that they were entitled to control others. The peace I found came not from their punishment, but from the knowledge that their ability to harm others had been permanently ended. The money they had stolen was being used to actually help sick children, their corrupt network had been dismantled, and their reputation as respected community leaders had been permanently destroyed. Justice wasn't just about consequences for their crimes, it was about preventing future crimes and protecting potential victims. 6 months after the final sentencing, I found myself standing in the same spot where this nightmare had begun, outside the gates of what used to be my family home. The mansion had been demolished, and the property was being developed into affordable housing for families transitioning out of homelessness. The symbolism wasn't lost on me that a place built on stolen money and criminal activity was being transformed into something that would actually help vulnerable people. Grace stood beside me, no longer the mysterious homeless woman who had saved my life, but the respected former federal agent who had become my closest friend and business partner. Marcus waited in the car, understanding that this moment needed to be shared only with the person who had been there during the darkest parts of the journey. Our relationship had grown stronger through shared trauma and mutual healing, but some experiences belonged to specific people who had lived through them together. The art therapy program had evolved into something neither Grace nor I had initially imagined. We now operated 3 locations across the state, serving not just homeless individuals and abuse survivors, but also veterans dealing with PTSD, teenagers aging out of foster care, and families recovering from addiction. The success stories were numerous and diverse, but they all shared common themes of people finding their voices and rebuilding their lives through creative expression and community support. My own artistic work had taken on deeper meaning and broader appeal as I processed my experiences and learned to transform trauma into something beautiful and healing. The pieces I created during the darkest periods of homelessness and fear were now displayed in permanent collections, serving as reminders that survival was possible and that creativity could flourish even in the most difficult circumstances. The contrast between those early works and my current pieces showed a journey of healing that inspired other survivors to believe in their own potential for recovery. The cottage that my family had been so desperate to control had been restored to its original condition and converted into a retreat center for artists working on trauma-related projects. My grandmother's studio, where she had first encouraged my artistic dreams, was preserved exactly as she had left it, complete with her easel and paint supplies. Young artists working through their own difficult experiences could use the space to connect with creative traditions while finding their own unique voices. Visiting my parents in prison had been a necessary part of my healing process, though not in the way I had initially expected. I didn't go to forgive them or seek reconciliation, but to confirm for myself that they were no longer capable of harming me or anyone else. Seeing them in prison uniforms, stripped of their wealth and influence, diminished rather than powerful, helped me understand that they were ultimately just ordinary people who had made terrible choices rather than the omnipotent figures they had seen during my childhood. The conversation was brief and unsatisfying. They showed no genuine remorse for their actions, instead focusing on their own perceived victimization by an unjust legal system. My father blamed prosecutorial overreach, while my mother insisted that their crimes had been exaggerated by hostile media coverage. Neither of them seemed capable of understanding the pain they had caused or the lives they had destroyed in pursuit of money and control. Courtney's situation was more complex. Her cooperation with investigators and her genuine breakdown during the legal proceedings suggested some capacity for remorse, but her attempts to contact me from witness protection were not welcome. The letter she sent through her handler expressed regret for her actions and asked for forgiveness, but it also revealed that she still didn't fully understand the scope of the harm she had participated in. Her focus remained primarily on her own suffering rather than on the victims of their families' crimes. The foundation established with proceeds from Hazel's book had grown into a significant resource for individuals facing retaliation from powerful interests. Legal aid attorneys, investigative journalists, and victim advocacy groups now had access to funding and expertise that could level the playing field when ordinary people confronted wealthy, influential abusers. The network of support that had formed around my case had evolved into a systematic approach to protecting whistleblowers and abuse survivors. Marcus and my wedding was a small, intimate ceremony held in the cottage garden where my grandmother had taught me to paint. Grace officiated, using her authority as a former federal agent to perform the ceremony, and the guest list included survivors from our programs alongside friends and colleagues who had supported us through the legal ordeal. The contrast between this celebration of love and healing and the toxic dysfunction of my biological family could not have been more stark. The young woman who approached me after my speech at a survivor conference reminded me powerfully of myself during the early days of homelessness. She was 26, recently escaped from an abusive family situation, struggling with depression and financial instability while trying to rebuild her life from nothing. Her story was different in details but similar in themes, and her request for mentorship brought the entire journey full circle. Teaching her about art therapy techniques and survival strategies, watching her discover her own creative voice and develop confidence in her abilities, gave my own experiences deeper meaning and purpose. Every person we helped in our programs represented not just an individual success, but also a victory over the forces of abuse and exploitation that had tried to destroy my own life. The cycle of healing expanded outward, creating ripple effects that touched hundreds of lives. The final lesson I learned was that family isn't determined by blood relationships or legal obligations, but by who chooses to stand with you during your darkest moments and celebrate your victories without jealousy or conditions. Grace, Marcus, and the community of survivors and supporters who surrounded me had become my true family, bound together by shared values and mutual care rather than obligation or manipulation. As I stand here today, looking back on everything that happened, I realize that my family's attempt to destroy me actually freed me to become the person I was meant to be. Their betrayal was devastating, but it also revealed the strength and resilience I didn't know I possessed. The life I built from nothing is more authentic and meaningful than anything I could have achieved within their corrupt system. If you've made it this far in my story, you've witnessed a journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Maybe you're facing your own family struggles or dealing with people who use their power to control and manipulate others. I want you to know that survival is possible, that justice can prevail, and that you can build a life worth living even after devastating betrayal. What part of this story resonated most with you? Have you experienced similar family betrayals or found your own path to healing after trauma? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it inspired you or made you think about toxic family dynamics differently. Subscribe to hear more stories of survival and transformation, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Share this with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggle against powerful people who try to silence them. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community that believes in the power of speaking truth and supporting survivors. Remember that your voice matters, your experiences are valid, and there are people willing to stand with you when you're ready to fight for your freedom and dignity. Until next time, keep creating, keep healing, and keep believing in the possibility of justice and peace.